Hello, welcome to the first Exploring Research seminar in our Spring 2022 programme, Parent Advocacy, Language and Imagery Relating to Cerebral Palsy in the Mid-20th Century. Thanks for joining us live today. My name is Angela Sayward. I'm a Research Development Specialist here at Wellcome Collection. My background is in moving image and sound. For those of you who cannot see the screen, I'm a white woman from Hertfordshire. I have shoulder-length curly silver hair. My pronouns are she, her. I'm wearing a grey top with gold horizontal stripes. I'm currently sitting in the loft of my house. As the title of the series suggests, these seminars explore current research that relates to our collections around topics that touch on how we think and feel about health. In the spring programme, we focus on material post-1850. For previous seminars we've delivered in the programme, please see the Wellcome Collection events page on our website. A link can be seen in the live chat. Our autumn programme will feature speakers that cover material from medieval and early modern periods. More details about this will be advertised throughout our research networks. Before I introduce our speaker, I just have to flag some housekeeping notices. This session will run for an hour. Our presenter, Dr. Teresa Hillier, will share a presentation with us for around 45 minutes, and there will be an opportunity to comment or ask questions via the live chat in YouTube. Please note, you require a YouTube account to do so. I will facilitate the questions at the end. If Teresa doesn't have time to answer them all, don't worry. We will send them on to her and she will attempt to respond in due course. We'll be sending this via Eventbrite to those who registered. Please note that this session is live and is being recorded. Just a quick heads up, we will have Welsh captions available during the broadcast via a separate link. The talk will be available to view again afterwards on YouTube with live BSL and speech-to-text captions in English. For attendees to this talk, we'd like to share a content advisory message. During the course of the presentation, some historical content will reflect words and opinions no longer current and now considered discriminatory in referring to disabled people and people with cerebral palsy. Scope has a helpline and can put you in touch with people or services if anything in this presentation gives you cause for concern for your past or present situation. Finally, a brief questionnaire will be sent out with a link to the recording after the event in which you can give us feedback. A link to this will also be available in the live chat at the end of this session. Please do take the time to fill this in to let us know how that we're doing, what sort of research you're interested in hearing about, and how we might improve the sessions in the future. This questionnaire includes an opportunity to sign up to join our Wellcome Collection Researchers Network. So now to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Teresa Hillier. Teresa's PhD was written consulting archives and online material at the British Library and Wellcome Collection. Wellcome has held the charity Scope's audiovisual archive for about 20 years, and these are digitised and available via our library catalogue. As an aside, in 2015, we received Scope's paper archives. Interested researchers should get in touch with us to find out more information about what's available in these archives as we work through them this year. And we should take this opportunity to wish Scope, which has campaigned for disabled people's rights for 70 years, a very happy birthday for 2022. Teresa's current research focus is looking at the life of Earl Carlson, born in Minneapolis, USA in 1897 with cerebral palsy. He enjoyed an international career as a leading physician. He came to Britain in 1947 on a lecture tour, and Carlson House School in Harborne, Birmingham was named after him. Teresa is exploring the impact he had. His autobiography was translated into 5 other languages. Also, Teresa is part of a community group who have secured funding and land for a garden. She's really excited about this venture and work begins soon. The aim of the project is to bring people together in a safe and inclusive area, promoting education, physical and mental health, and positive well-being through horticulture. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Teresa Hillier.
Thank you, Angela. for your very kind introduction and for inviting me to speak about my research. Thanks also to the organisers of the Welcome and the interpreters, captioners for making this session accessible. So my name is Teresa Hillier. I am a woman from Wales with white skin and short brown hair. I am wearing a multicoloured floral top and also wearing glasses. I use the pronouns she, her. I am based near Swansea and I am talking to you from my office at home, and behind me is a bookcase. In this talk, I will discuss parent-led associations set up in the mid-20th century in response to new legislation which created inequality for children with cerebral palsy. I will show how successful fundraising campaigns used emotional language and imagery to meet objectives, which led to the creation of a stereotypical image of someone with cerebral palsy. This overshadowed the positive advances that were made. There are 3 oral history video extracts and 2 short film clips included in this presentation. Language used in relation to disability has changed over time, and words once generally accepted are now viewed as offensive. The term spastic is one such word, but it is used in this talk in an historical context. I became interested in researching this topic while working for a charity based in Swansea. It was then known as Swansea and District Spastic Association. I gradually became more aware of the history of the association and what it meant, not only to those who it supported, but also to a much wider network of families and friends. And at that time, many of the original founder members of the charity were still alive, playing an active role within the organisation. I was struck by the sense of community and dedication that has kept the organisation going for many years. Through regular interaction, I gained an insight into the challenges that individuals and families had, that they had faced historically, and also the conflicts and frustrations that sometimes arose. But this organisation was my motivation to explore in more detail the wider history of parent-led associations. And the next slide, please. So what is cerebral palsy? Cerebral palsy is a condition that can affect movement, posture and coordination, and verbal communication. Its symptoms are unique to each person, ranging from mild to more profound. And there are different types of cerebral palsy. Spastic cerebral palsy, where the muscles are stiff and tight, affecting movement. Athetoid cerebral palsy can cause involuntary spasms or movements to the body. And ataxic cerebral palsy affects balance and coordination. But a person may also have a mix of these symptoms. To find out more about cerebral palsy, a good place to start would be with SCOPE, the Disability Equality Charity. And the next slide, please. Historically, a limited understanding or a misunderstanding of the symptoms of cerebral palsy was in part due to a lack of documentation identifying it as a specific condition. It was not until the 19th century that definitive descriptions began to emerge through the work of William John Little, William Osler, and Sigmund Freud. Little was an English orthopaedic surgeon born in 1810 with a disability. He had a club foot and partial paralysis of his left leg. He is credited as being instrumental in defining spastic cerebral palsy and associated it with the problems that may have occurred during the birth process. Publishing widely, he did not use the term cerebral palsy specifically, and the condition became commonly known as Little's disease. Building on the achievements of Little, Canadian physician William Osler is referred to as the first person who used the term cerebral palsy, and he also identified other types of the condition. He published his research in 1889 in a book entitled The Cerebral Palsies of Children. It was in 1893 that psychiatrist Sigmund Freud published a book about cerebral diplegias in children. Freud questioned the assertion that a difficult birth may have contributed to the cause of cerebral palsy, arguing that it was more likely to be as a result of the development of problems in the brain and central nervous system prior to birth. But the findings of these three individuals did not really progress within the fields of clinical research until the early 20th century, with the work of American orthopedic surgeon Winthrop Phelps. And the next slide, please. Phelps developed diagnostic and treatment techniques, adopting a more holistic approach towards cerebral palsy. Writing in 1941 in the Journal of the Southern Medical Association, Phelps said how cerebral palsy had become of interest to orthopedic surgeons as it had been studied in the past, probably the least of any of the major handicaps in point of frequency. Strongly advocating for therapy treatments such as physiotherapy and speech therapy, Phelps said these should be started as early as possible, ideally in childhood. A booklet, The Father's Corner, written under the direction of Phelps for the National Society for Crippled Children, as it was then known, states that with proper teaching and training, children with cerebral palsy often can and do improve physically. The booklet stresses constant teamwork by a range of professionals in order to make progress with the child, advocating that parents be a part of the team. His approach considered the many aspects and complexities of cerebral palsy, but adopting a new approach was not straightforward. The influence of pervasive eugenic ideologies, which embedded racism and disablism in scientific thought, had far-reaching consequences for the implementation of educational policy reform in post-war Britain. Opinion was heavily skewed by ideologies which included institutionalization in long-stay hospitals and the segregation of children who had a range of different disabilities. The next slide, please. In Britain, the 1944 Education Act was at the heart of post-war change. This led to a new level of bureaucracy, where medical professionals categorised children using an assessment process to measure aptitude and ability. With this optimistic vision, this act mapped out a new era for education. The Times newspaper reports it as the outstanding event of the year. Its enactment meant that statutory responsibility to deliver education fell to newly formed education departments within local authority areas. Section 34(1) of the 1944 Act states that it was the duty of every local education authority to ascertain which children in their area required special educational treatment. But this new approach was not equitable towards children who needed extra support to participate in education. And failure to meet normative patterns raised economic issues as more resources were needed to meet pupil needs. So rather than provide more opportunities, this reform highlighted disparities and gave rise to more inequalities. So how did this impact children with cerebral palsy? Well, as part of the assessment process, they had to undergo a physical examination by a medical professional and IQ testing to determine their suitability for education. Contemporary sources reveal that a common experience during the assessment process was that there was more emphasis on what could not be achieved rather than on what could be. The dominance of the medical model of disability naturally led to a medical framework being used to discover what was wrong with the individual's body, with a primary focus on rehabilitation. Being simply viewed as a medical case, to be improved in the physical sense was compounded by the limited understanding of the complexities of cerebral palsy, often leading to children being misdiagnosed and misunderstood. Anecdotal evidence from personal testimonies reveals having a child born with cerebral palsy in the mid-20th century was likely to be viewed as a personal misfortune, with many parents being advised to forget about their child and not hold out any hope for their future. The lack of consideration afforded to cognitive function meant that a child was placed under the jurisdiction of the health authority. The 1944 Education Act legitimised the classification of some children as ineducable. So being labelled in this way meant exclusion from education and affected other areas of their lives. For example, it denied children access to free milk, parents could not claim family allowances, and crucially, being set apart from their peers denied them the opportunity to develop socially, a hot topic during the school closures of the current pandemic. It was difficult to challenge the ineducable label, which strengthened long-held archaic views that linked a physical disability to an intellectual impairment. The following video clips you're going to see are from the oral histories of Valerie Lang, born in 1939, Pat Entwistle, born in 1940, and Lynn Berwick, born in 1950. They were interviewed as part of Speaking for Ourselves, a 2004 National Heritage Lottery Fund project by Scope. This project captured life histories with the aim of showing how society's perception of disability had changed during the 20th century. And the clips run for approximately 90 seconds. Please play the oral history video clips.
I went to see a neurologist, and I was 18 months old by then. They stripped my clothing off and he held me upside down by my feet, watched the pattern of my body as I screamed, and everything went into spasm, and he said, "This child is spastic. Take her home. Forget about her. She'll never be any good. You're wasting my time, your time, and everybody else's."
The diagnosis was not helpful. They just followed the book, which said cerebral palsy is included, which was then mental handicap, and therefore they were constantly telling my parents I was ineducable. They didn't know what to do with me at all. I'm talking about 1940 to 43. There was 250 children, and I was the only disabled child there. I used to try and walk, and the other kids used to push me over.
So these narratives show how it was too easy to dismiss children with cerebral palsy as ineducable and to be at a loss as to how to accommodate their needs. But these stories are not isolated incidents, as many others faced similar situations. A one-size-fits-all approach may have made economic sense, but with respect to educating children with cerebral palsy, it rather exacerbated problems, and a fair system could not be achieved. Children needed the services of those who could better understand their needs, and also the investment of time in order to be fairly tested and extra support needs adequately explored and understood. And the next slide, please. Could you play slide 7, the cerebral palsy problem? Thank you. The inequity created by the 1944 Education Act had effectively singled out many children with cerebral palsy as special cases. Such inequities were discussed in April 1948 at a conference organised by the British Council for the Welfare of Spastics. This conference looked at the medical, educational and social aspects of the cerebral palsy problem. Winthrop Phelps's work was debated in some detail, and it was acknowledged that significant resources were needed to support these children. Yet it was virtually impossible to gauge the level of such resources, as there had been no comprehensive system of registration within Britain to determine the number of children who had cerebral palsy, and its exact incidence was unknown. 3 surveys conducted at the end of the 1940s supported the growing realisation of the significant number of children within the population for whom there was no adequate state-supported provision. The studies were undertaken by the British Council for the Welfare of Spastics, the University of Birmingham and Birmingham Institute of Child Health, and the Ministry of Education. But incomplete data could not give a true picture, and the official figure was put at 1 per 1,000, although it was suggested that it could be higher. Whilst this was a step in the right direction, the statistics did nothing to address the ambiguity surrounding cerebral palsy and the numerous situations being faced by families. Conflicting priorities within different geographical areas meant that there were inconsistencies to the levels of support given to families. The realities of individual situations could simply not be adequately addressed, and this made it too easy to categorise children as ineducable. As parents became more aware of other families facing similar situations, they decided to join forces to challenge the discriminatory practices which marginalised their children. And the next slide, please. It is not difficult to imagine how parents may have felt, as the external physical characteristics of cerebral palsy seemingly determined whether or not a child could achieve a level of education. Exclusion from education and a lack of support and services were cited as shared frustrations. Stanley Segal, respected educator and disability campaigner, discussed the failings of the 1944 Education Act in his book, No Child is Ineducable, and said of the Act, it was shaped at a time when the whole nation was aware more than ever before of fundamental human values. However, the failure to include those deemed to be ineducable in the new climate gave desperate parents new energy, countering the assumption that the majority of children with cerebral palsy were mentally defective. Commonly referred to as spastic associations, a network of groups was established during the late 1940s and the early 1950s. Within these groups, parents were united in their resolve to challenge a system which had wronged their children. And it was with the formation of the National Spastic Society in 1952, or the NSS as I will now refer to it, that the network began to grow. The 1953 annual report of the NSS states that the number of parents in groups had risen from 700 to over 3,000. And the 1954 annual report records the number of groups at 85. Parents wanted to explain in simple terms what cerebral palsy was, showing the issues that they faced. And the image taken from the NSS 1953 annual report shown here addresses some of the questions raised regarding intelligence and treatment. And so to consider how these parents may have felt, we can use the example of the current pandemic. School closures and its impact on pupils have been a prominent topic of debate. Issues raised are broader than education and have encompassed mental health and well-being, isolation and vulnerable pupils. This highlights the important role that schools play in society. It is not just about education, but also social interaction. Whilst the terms mental health and well-being may not have been articulated by post-war parents, these issues were very pertinent to their cause. And the formation of associations were indeed life-changing moments for many families who had been isolated within society. And I want to give you a sense of the strength of feeling parents had and what the setting up of associations meant to them. The next slide, please. A parent from the Midlands described how it felt to meet up with other parents, saying, "It was a tremendously liberating experience for many of us and for many of our children who until then had been housebound. Many parents felt embarrassed and even angry at the curiosity shown by passers-by at the contortions and grimaces of our children. And we realised the need to educate the general public to recognise spastics and accept them in society. This we did by addressing meetings and by arranging outings to public places." And a parent from Swansea spoke of a crusade-like campaign, saying that parents were like pioneers who blazed the trail centuries ago. They had faith in God, faith in their offspring, and faith in mankind. And through that indomitable faith was born a resolve to first educate the public in a problem that not even the state or local government had really appreciated. The next slide, please. Parents did not want their children to be hidden away as social outcasts, and they sought to confront society's prejudices and lack of knowledge about the effects of cerebral palsy. With the NSS, a consolidated campaign began. Publicising research activities was one of the aims and objectives of parent associations in order to further understand the complexities of cerebral palsy. Other aspects were more concerned with achieving practical outcomes, such as improved access to treatment, training and education, and the setting up of schools dedicated to children with cerebral palsy and providing support for families. Supporting adults was also part of this campaign, but it is fair to say that it was the focus on children which was the driving force. So to move ahead with these ideals, funding was required, and the NSS committed to raising £1 million in 5 years, not an insignificant amount of money. Appealing directly to the general public, associations utilised the popular media of the day. For example, a series of comic strips in the Daily Mirror newspaper in May 1952 featured a fictional family, the Ruggles. Through seemingly everyday conversation, the Ruggles family discussed cerebral palsy. Journalist Chris Davis, born with cerebral palsy and involved with the NSS from a young child, said how Mr. and Mrs. Ruggles were the Mirror's social conscience, and through the comic strip gave its 15 million readers 6 days of factual, easily understood views about children with cerebral palsy. This simple but effective method started a dialogue within society, and also a debate at a national and local level, as the stance taken by the NSS was largely mirrored in the work of local parent groups. So before discussing this in further detail, we're going to view a short film clip from The Chance of Their Lives, which was made in 1952. The opening scenes focus on 4 people, ranging from a small child in the playground to a young man seeking work. And the clip is just over 3 minutes long. So can you play Chance of Their Lives film clip, please?
No, it's no good. There's plenty of fun around, but it's not for him. His legs are useless. It's good to see this little girl smile, but at least she can walk. There's no smile here. She has never walked. And who'll look after her when her devoted parents have gone? This young man wants a job, the chance to earn a living. Well, would you employ him? Would you gamble on a fellow who looks willing, but, well, what job could you give him? That lad is a spastic. So was the little boy floundering in the playground, and the little girl who could just walk, and the woman who couldn't. Spastic. Maybe you've never heard of it. But there are 30,000 spastics in Great Britain, and they're not getting much help. When that little boy and girl grow up, there won't be jobs for them. The world will be full of shut doors, unless a lot of things happen.
The Chance of Their Lives is a short film. It's only 18 minutes long, but it packs a powerful impact. As you've seen, the opening of the film is accompanied by lively music and apparently healthy children running around in a playground setting. But as the music suddenly comes to a dramatic stop, a stark reality is portrayed. From the solitary child with no playmates to the solitary man with no prospect of employment. The narrator refers collectively to Spastics, asking the viewer if they had heard of them, and for them to consider what it would mean to be one. The sincerity of this question is enhanced through the film's narrator, Wilfred Pickles, an actor and well-known radio presenter of the time. Now, the overt purpose of this film was to highlight the difficulties and the prejudices faced by people with cerebral palsy in everyday life. For the viewer, the unfolding scenes evoke feelings of sympathy, and it is relatively easy to place yourself in the situations portrayed. There is an allusion to what could be achieved if only support was given and opportunities available. The poignant discourse and emotive imagery depicted sets the scene for a much wider campaign, which was to effectively market cerebral palsy as a cause to support. And the term spastic was one which was deliberately chosen, making it part of the marketing brand, so that it quickly became a signifier within popular culture, identifiable with people who had cerebral palsy. And this approach came to be routine, forming a traditional part of the business of the NSS and local associations. In depicting scenes from everyday life, the NSS reached out to ordinary families seeking their backing. At its inception, the NSS identified a specific audience to target, which was described as the housewife, the school children, the factory and the office workers. It declared an attack was to be made on the public imagination and these groups to be pursued for their pennies. Now, the following extract is from the film Every 8 Hours, which was made in 1960. And this film gives a real sense of the ways in which cerebral palsy was marketed. And this clip is just over 4 minutes long. Can you play Every 8 Hours film clip, please?
Now, the longer you delay treatment of a growing spastic, the less the child will improve. Parents knew this and were desperate. And now enter 4 completely new people, each of them determined to do something more about this awful problem. Ian Dawson-Shepherd, Alex Moira, Eric Hodgson, and Jean Garwood. It is 1951, and with a capital of £5, they start the National Spastic Society. They draw up a 5-year plan to raise £1 million, to establish parents' groups in every big town, to open local and national pilot centres for spastics, to persuade the powers that be, local authorities or Westminster, to set up more and more centres, and to tell the British public what it's all about, to tell it loud and clear to the lucky ones, the ones like us. Perhaps 1 person in 1,000 had heard the word spastic, and fewer still knew what it meant. Every means was used to reach the people. The Daily Mirror featured Spastics in its Ruggles cartoon. Money's the thing, you know. Money can buy a lot more than you imagine. Parents' groups started collection drives. because sometimes the only way to get money is to go out and ask for it. A good cause? No. A proper cause. A righteous cause. A decent justification for a fit man's right to be strong and straight and in command of his body. There were hundreds of thousands of leaflets. The press, the television, the newsreels and the radio paid attention. New parents' groups were started in England and Wales. There even arrived a special Spastics newspaper to keep everyone in touch, in communication.
Target £1 million.
It didn't come in all that easily to begin with. Does money ever come in easily? But there were many devices. In 1953, there came the Christmas seals. First, 2 million of them. Now, 160 million. Pubs turned themselves into a network of collecting centres. There were new ideas in shops. And then in came show business. The entertainers started their own efforts with Wilfred Pickles, the Stars organization for Spastics.
£1 million for Spastics.
And in 1957...
Target achieved.
And then, crisis. Growth had been so rapid that within a few months, 1 million wasn't enough. Plans for expansion couldn't get underway. But a bold announcement was made. The target for the next 3 years was £2 million, every penny of which would be needed for the job that had to be done. And in 1959...
Target achieved again.
£3 million in all. Money out of the public's pocket, your pocket.
So in terms of marketing cerebral palsy, this extract from Every 8 Hours presents us with a success story. And as an organisation, the NSS was successful. A Daily Mirror article from 1957 said that the NSS was not a polite charity. It reported that its approach was blunt, its methods unorthodox, and its progress phenomenal. Within 5 years, it became one of the top 6 charities in Britain educating the public about cerebral palsy. And the article suggests that 2 words explain its success, and these were parents and pennies. And parents and pennies were indeed at the heart of this public campaign. The narrator tells us how every means was used to reach the people. The depiction of newspapers and leaflets being frenetically printed implies that the campaign was a fast-moving one. A sense of urgency is conveyed. From the everyday conversation of the Ruggles family, tabloid newspapers brought personal and human interest stories about ordinary families and their struggles into people's homes. Adopting an emotional rhetoric, the perceived tragedy of cerebral palsy is laid before our eyes. This continued through a range of publicity materials, where through overt messages, an appeal was made directly to an individual's moral responsibility to give to those supposedly less fortunate. We can see how those stories were shared through newsreels, television and radio, reaching a wide audience. Celebrity involvement through the organisation Stars Organisation for Spastics brings to life how invested the NSS was as an organisation which drew on publicity in order to raise money and draw support. We are told money is the thing as we learn of the successes of parent groups and their collection drives, and how the NSS has already raised 1 million and that it is essential to raise a further 2 million. We are asked of the campaign, is it a good cause? And the answer is no, it is a proper cause, a righteous cause. The visual representation of pennies falling from above, being drawn towards collecting tins, or the pile of pennies being toppled over in an everyday social setting, leaves the viewer in no doubt of the message being conveyed. And what of the narrator? Richard Dimbleby, a respected journalist and broadcaster with the BBC. Why would we not believe him? This approach towards, towards fundraising appears simple but effective. And essentially it was carefully crafted to gain the maximum impact. Achieving a high level of coverage was possible through the support of the network of local associations. Individually, parents had been largely powerless, but collectively they could win support, and the emotional connection to the cause made it easy to embrace the concept of collective action. And the next slide, please. So one of the initial aims of the NSS had been to raise an awareness of cerebral palsy within society, fostering its understanding and explaining it in simple terms. However, its public portrayal within popular culture conjured up images of a vulnerable and helpless child, which was directly at odds with promoting a can-do attitude. It can be said that the intense marketing effectively made some of the aims counterproductive and more difficult to achieve. Individuality and diversity were lost, as people with cerebral palsy were portrayed as one homogenous group. Marketing success had formed the basis for a discrete level of social control over individual lives, which had extended to adults with cerebral palsy. And the next slide, please. The public portrayal of disability did not reflect human frailties, but rather the apparent difficulties of impairment. Where more positive stories did emerge, it was stressed that people were being helped through the efforts of others rather than achieving through individual effort. The success of the public campaign had shaped public perception, and this conflicted with the ideal that people could be successful given the right support. The overwhelming dominant imagery gave the idea that charitable support was the only option available. Little was said to refute these prevailing views, and any efforts made to highlight prejudices were effectively countered by a dominant and stereotypical interpretation. Alan Council, aged 18 in 1955, asked his doctor to explain his disability. Revealing the circumstances of Alan's birth, which had caused damage to his brain, Alan felt shocked, as he could not comprehend that there was something wrong with his brain, which he linked to his intellect. His doctor told him he had never wanted to put a label on him, but in common language, Alan was a spastic. This made Alan extremely angry, as he could not identify with this image. His doctor told him that he was reacting exactly like the ill-informed majority of people, and the words spastic and brain damage were very emotive because people didn't fully understand their meaning. Alan referred to his doctor as being wise in not labelling him. Reflecting on his life in later years, he said, There are still those who may laugh at me and misunderstand me, for in many situations I look peculiar. But this is only because they make comparisons which label me as different. If only I could be viewed as an individual, if only people would realise that I was born the way I am, and that for me to talk and use my body the way I do is normal. Were I to speak or use my hands and body like the majority of people, I would not be me. It is absolutely normal for me to function the way I do. If it were not for those comparisons, maybe I might be seen as a person rather than as an oddity. This dichotomy can be said to have been evident from the outset, with a contradiction between the private and the public facade of marketing the tragedy of cerebral palsy. And the next and last slide, please. It is unlikely that parents were initially thinking of the long-term consequences that might arise through their actions. They were dealing with an immediate situation, a crisis, and adopted methods used at the time. As a Birmingham parent said, "Far fewer will know just what the new beginning meant to those of us who had travelled painfully through that early period when the word spastic was unknown." So through seemingly little effort, the marketing of cerebral palsy almost took on a life of its own. It was rather inevitable that the emotional rhetoric which dominated publicity contributed to negative perceptions. The public portrayal overshadowed the progress made and masked the true capabilities of people with cerebral palsy. And this is a paradox which is sometimes difficult to reconcile. The communities created by associations forged lifelong friendships within supportive environments. Through parents' actions, diverse individuals were brought together from the fields of medicine and education. Dissemination of new research and the adoption of different practices relating to cerebral palsy was actively supported. Associations facilitated a significant contribution to the development of a body of knowledge and expertise in the understanding of cerebral palsy. And the contribution of parent associations is largely overlooked historically. Without the actions taken by parents, what realistic chance did children with cerebral palsy have in post-war Britain? As campaigns became political as well as personal, we can see parents as reformers who campaigned widely on issues of entitlement and access to services. They took action when no other support was available. And it is important not to lose sight of parents' motivation and to remind ourselves that their endeavours came from a basic humanity to challenge a system which had wronged their children. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks so much for this fascinating presentation, Teresa.
Thank you.
Yeah, I expect you might like to pause for breath.
Yeah.
We have had some really interesting questions in. I was going to ask you about the word ineducable and what that meant for children and their families, but I think you did address that really quite well in your presentation, and that still has resonances today. So let me just start with the first question, which I thought was really interesting. How did the NSS define every big town as mentioned in the every 8 hours video? And was there much support for rural families at this time?
That's a really interesting question. I think at that time there were lots of groups being formed in sort of local areas. It was, as I said, I think it was 85 groups had formed by 1955, I think it was. I can't say I really know what they meant by every big town. I can only sort of go by what they depicted.
I guess that's about their ambition. Their ambition was to be very everywhere. And it's quite extraordinary. Even 85 is a big number.
Yeah, I mean, thinking about it from Wales then, I know there were lots of groups within a relatively small area, sort of, and as far as the rural areas go, I think maybe it was more difficult to catch up with all of the children in those areas. And I think that was part of their drive, was to reach out to rural areas as much as to the bigger towns.
I mean, certainly some of the kind of local organisations that you've written about are kind of very much attached to bigger cities like Swansea and Birmingham, where there's a kind of cluster of families and more services available. Okay, so let's go and look at another question. So in your research, were there crossovers either informally or officially with other charities which supported children with disabilities? And then sort of, were there similarities or differences in approaches?
Well, sort of a direct comparison can be made with what was then, what is now known as MenCap. And it was then, I think it was the National Society for Backward Children. It was known as when it started, and that was through parent advocacy. My research, and particularly through looking at association minutes, they were quite strict with who they admitted, particularly in the early days. It was very focused on just cerebral palsy. And I don't know what sort of, whether they linked up with other charities. I think they were very driven purely by that motive then to help their children and to do, to move forward with that. But it would be really good, a really good study actually, to maybe compare how MenCap look at their history and compare it with what is now Scope, to look at, how they approach things.
And of course, we also have the archives of the Thalidomide Society, and I think there's definitely some commonalities between the parents and this kind of how they drove the activities of the charity.
Yes.
The other interesting thing is the every 8 hours the film was actually shown on BBC television.
Okay, yeah.
Twice. It was shown in 1960 and 1961. So that the parents are really very dynamic in their approach, and I think that's something that in your writing is quite interesting. So that kind of actually mitigated. It became a bit problematic, didn't it? When as kind of the children that grew into adults wanting greater agency, and the parents were perhaps kind of barriers to that. Do you want to say a little bit more about that in terms of your research?
Yeah. I think that possibly when they started out, they didn't envisage that they were going to be so successful, and it almost, I think, as I said, it took on a life of its own. And in those early days, they were purely focused on education because that was the immediate need then that they had to address. And when their children, the original children then became young adults, the associations were still very much hubs of success. They were still actively going. So I think that parents looked at the next stage then, and they introduced sheltered employment work centres. And And I mean, Scope is its 70th anniversary, and there's lots of other organisations that are still going. And I don't think that when they started, they didn't expect that they would be so successful and still be active all these years later.
And the pervasiveness of that kind of the poster child, which was illustrated in some of your slides, that endured for really quite some time, didn't it? From the the early days, from the 1960s onwards.
Yeah, well, it wasn't until I think it was 1994 that there was a change of name. That was the Spastic Society became Scope, and then that filtered out to the local organisations, and eventually they all changed their name.
We have one more question. We really are running out of time.
Okay.
Apologies. So this is some feedback and a question from the audience. I really like the way that you showed how marketing cerebral palsy was necessary in order to raise money, but detrimental to public perceptions of people with cerebral palsy. And this is quite a difficult thing. Does this still happen today?
That is a difficult question. Looking at it historically, I can totally understand the motives. There were so many different organisations. They needed the money to do the research so I can understand how they did it, or why they did it rather. Does it still happen today? Maybe children are presented in a more positive light, but it is a difficult balancing act, I think, and one that needs a lot of more thought and consideration.
So unfortunately, we are now at time. And if we didn't get to your question, we'll forward all the questions to Teresa and email her answers to all attendees. Once again, thanks so much for such a fascinating seminar, Teresa.
Thank you.
Look out for their AV assistants, and Michelle and Lynn for their brilliant BSL interpretation. Our thanks again to Teresa and to you for attending.